Hello chemistry students. In this video I'm going to go over reaction kinetics. Alright, so chemical kinetics is the area of chemistry where you study reaction mechanisms and the rates of reactions. Alright, so we'll start off and I'll tell you what a reaction process is. That is the mechanism, step-by-step sequence of events that takes place during the chemical reaction. That is going to describe the pathway by which reactants become products. Elementary reactions are single steps of that reaction process. Some reactions only have one step, and then some reactions have two or more steps, and they're called complex reactions. Alright, collision theory states that in order for reactants to become products, they have to collide or somehow come in contact with each other with sufficient energy to react. Okay, if they don't have enough kinetic energy, the particles are just going to bounce off of each other. So in this diagram, you can see that you have the blue particle and the red particle, two blue atoms, two red atoms, and the blurriness here is trying to show you that the blue one is going down and the red one is going up. And in the first situation, they collide with each other and they just bounce off. The two blues are still together and the two reds are still together. In the second diagram here, you can see that the blurry marks are a little bit longer. That's showing that they're moving faster. So this time they collide with sufficient energy that the reaction takes place. So instead of being two blue ones bonded together, now you have a blue one and a red one and a blue one and a red one. That might be something like the reaction of hydrogen with chlorine, maybe. So H2 plus Cl2 makes HCl, and if they collide with enough energy, the reaction takes place. Alright, so here is a couple of things, or really here are a couple of things that determine if a collision is going to be effective. The first we've sort of already talked about is that the particles have to have enough energy. So not that this is a perfect representation, but kind of the idea here is that you have to give those particles some energy. They have to be above a certain threshold before they'll go down and make products. Kind of like this guy pushing the rock up the hill. He can push it up and, until it gets to the gravitational energy at the top of the hill, it's just going to roll back down to where it was. So that's kind of like the activation energy. Once you get it over that minimum amount, then it's going to be able to proceed and make products. The other thing that can affect this is that the collisions sometimes have to occur at the proper orientation. So what it looks like is taking place here is that the blue is bonding to the red on here and making a blue red 2, kind of like an H2O, except maybe we don't know what the molecules are. This is just an example. So if red and red hit each other, that doesn't work. If the red hits the blue in the middle, that doesn't work. If the blue hits the blue in the middle, that doesn't work. And then even if they're turned at kind of the wrong angle here, maybe you can think back to, maybe there's a lone pair out here that has to hit that so that it can bond like a kind of like a Lewis acid-base interaction or something like that. Then all those are ineffective collisions. But when it's oriented properly, then the collision occurs. So that is something that would maybe make this reaction be slower than another one that's less specific about the orientation of the particles, even if the temperature and the activation energy were the same. Alright, so an activated complex is defined as being the temporary combination of reactant particles that have formed and they have enough energy to overcome the activation energy or the energy barrier. Okay, so the activated complex would be shown as this combination of molecules here. And then on an energy pathway diagram, the activated complex would be whatever is present at the top of the heel. So that's the activated complex, and the difference between the energy level of the reactants and the activated complex is called the activation energy. The smaller the activation energy, typically the faster the reaction, and the larger the activation energy, typically the slower the reaction, because the more particles in your sample actually have enough energy to overcome the activation energy, the faster the reaction is going to go. And then maybe you can remember this is the enthalpy change, the difference between the product energy level and the reactant energy level and the product energy level. Right. There can also be reaction intermediates. So some reactions are not single step. Some of them are complex, and so you might have multiple intermediates before you finally get to the products, and then you'd have multiple activation energies here. And you could kind of think about this, that this one would probably be the slowest step because it has the greatest activation energy. That would be the difference between this intermediate and there. So it has, well, I guess we could go back. It would be close between the first step and this step, because that distance between the reactant and that first activation energy and the distance between this intermediate and that activation energy, they're actually pretty close. So these two steps would probably be slower than the distance between this intermediate and this activated complex, this intermediate and that activated complex. Those two steps would probably be faster. Alright, so reaction rates are defined as being the number of reactant particles that are reacting to form product per unit of time, or you could look at that as the change in concentration of the reactants per unit time as the reaction takes place. So, some of the factors that influence how quickly the reaction takes place are temperature, concentration, particle size, and catalyst, or the presence thereof. Alright, so if you increase the temperature, that increases the reaction rate. And that makes sense, because the higher the temperature, the faster the particles move, the more likely they're going to exceed the activation energy, and also the more collisions are going to take place. So typically a rule of thumb is that every 10 degrees you increase the temperature, that results in a doubling of the reaction rate. A place where that's easy to notice is perhaps with a fire, because when the temperature of the fire or the wood is low, the burning is at a slower rate. When it gets really hot, then the reaction rate of that fire is much faster. Alright, concentration also affects the rate of reactions. So the more concentrated the solution, usually we talk about concentration in terms of solutions, sometimes with gases, but usually with aqueous solutions in chemistry. So basically, the more particles are dissolved, the more likely they are to collide, and the more collisions, the higher the reaction rate. An example of that, if you go back into a laboratory prep room and you get out some hydrochloric acid, if you get 3 molar hydrochloric acid and you spill it on your hand and it burns you, it won't be as bad as if you got 12 molar hydrochloric acid, which is concentrated, and you poured that on your hand, and that would burn you much quicker and probably cause more damage in the time it would take you to get that rinsed off. Okay, gas pressure has a similar effect, but it's only pressure that affects gases. It doesn't really affect the reaction rates for liquids or solids to a tremendous degree. So if you have a gas, increasing the pressure really you are increasing the concentration because you're just squeezing those gas particles closer together. And remember, there's a lot of space between gas particles. So if you do squeeze them together, that does make them closer together and make them more likely to have collisions and therefore increase the reaction rate. All right, the size of particles also affects the rate of chemical reactions. The smaller the particles, the larger the surface area. You can think about that like if you take something and grind it up, you can spread it over a larger area. And that increase in surface area makes it more likely for the reactant particles to collide and form product particles. An example of that would be either a chemical factory or a sawmill where there's dust being produced, and if that dust builds up while the wood itself or whatever materials are being manufactured in the factory, they might not be particularly flammable, but the dust, on the other hand, since it has a small particle size and therefore a large surface area, might be very reactive. There have been several instances of manufacturing facilities having dust accumulate in places and that leading to fires starting, or even a plant in Kinston, North Carolina a few years ago actually exploded because of the dust that had accumulated above the ceiling tiles in that factory that had gone unnoticed. So, and then with sawdust, if you ever throw sawdust into a campfire, for example, you will notice that it burns up much more rapidly than the bigger chunks of wood. All right, and lastly, catalyst. What they do is they are chemical substances that reduce the activation energy needed for a reaction to occur, and that makes the reaction rate increase. So catalysts, they're going to change the rate without actually being consumed by the reaction. So they're going to be written above the reaction arrow for that reason. So we show here with maybe the exhaust coming out of your car, carbon monoxide and oxygen atoms get together to make CO2. CO2 is much less dangerous for you to breathe than carbon monoxide. So there's a platinum catalyst inside of the catalytic converter that assists with catching the oxygen atoms, and then that allows them to combine with the carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide to make carbon dioxide. And again, it's shown above the reaction arrow because it doesn't actually get used up by the reaction. Another enzyme you've probably seen is the catalase in pretty much all living things. It'll react with hydrogen peroxide and break the hydrogen peroxide down into oxygen in water, and as a result you see bubbles where the oxygen is being formed. That reaction is very slow without the presence of the catalase enzyme. Alright, so shown on the energy pathway diagram or reaction pathway diagram, without the catalyst the activation energy is higher. With the catalyst the activation energy is lower. So the catalyzed reaction is going to proceed faster because more of the molecules will have the minimum activation energy needed to proceed forward. Notice that the overall energy change of the reaction from reactants to products is the same. So the enthalpy change is still the same. There's the same different distance or difference between the reactants and the products. It's just the activation energy gets lowered. All right, and enzymes work in a similar fashion. So the reactants fit into the enzyme. The enzyme maybe holds them in place so that they in the proper orientation so they can react, and then that produces a product which is released by the enzyme. Notice the enzyme is present before and after, so while it assists with the reaction, it is not used up in the reaction. Alright folks, thanks for watching.